This is a 2006 Chevy Corvette Z06, and it's a lot of car for the money. There's a lot of talk about the original C5 Z06 being a great value, but this car puts up some seriously amazing numbers. Over 500 horsepower from a 7-liter V8, and you can buy it for the same price as a new Honda CR-V. Today, I'm going to review the C6 Z06 and show you all of its quirks and features and explain why it's so appealing. Before I get started, big news, this C6 Z06 is currently for sale and it's being auctioned live on Cars and Bids. This Z06 has a great color combination, reasonable mileage, it's not modified, and it has that all-important big power and manual transmission, and you can buy it on Cars and Bids. So, once you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below to visit the live auction for this C6 Z06, where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. All right, time for the quirks and features of the C6 Z06, starting with a little overview of what this is. Of course, it's the high-performance version of the regular Chevy Corvette. These days, the Z06 is well known and well established, but in the C6 era, it was still a new thing. It had just started on the C5 model before this, and they were still feeling out exactly what to do, and in this car, what to do was a massive engine, the LS7 V8, which is a 7-liter, 427 cubic inch, naturally aspirated V8 that made 505 horsepower. This engine is huge. In fact, it is the most powerful naturally aspirated General Motors engine ever until the brand new Z06, which came out like yesterday. This engine held that title for all those years. It's just big and it's got big power. It was used in one other General Motors vehicle, which was the Chevy Camaro Z28 from this era, but it's primarily remembered for the C6 Z06, 7-liter. But while the big power was a big upgrade for the Z06, it had 105 more horsepower than the regular C6 Corvette, which had 400, it wasn't just about power. This car had a lot of other changes compared to a standard Corvette as well. The biggest and most obvious is it was wider. It had flared fenders in front and in back, a little bit wider, a little bit brawnier look, and they were flared out to contain the tires, which were also wider to handle the extra power. And of course, bigger tires, bigger fenders, you got to do bigger wheels, and so the C6 Z06 also has a distinctive looking wheel and a larger design than what you got in the standard Corvette. And the changes didn't stop there. The Z06 also had improved brakes compared to the standard Corvette and increased cooling. There was a larger radiator, but upgrades to the cooling system all throughout the car in addition to that for on-track performance when it started to get hot. And yet, the C6 Z06 wasn't that heavy. In fact, it was actually 14 pounds lighter than the standard Corvette. Now, that's a surprise because adding stuff usually makes a car heavier. A bigger engine, wider fenders, bigger tires, bigger wheels, bigger brakes, it all usually combines for more weight. But Chevy did a great weight savings job here. Most notable was the aluminum frame, which saved 140 pounds by itself compared to the standard Corvette. Other weight savings trickery throughout this car helped to neutralize all the weight gain with all the extras and brought it down 15 pounds lighter than standard Corvette. It also weighed less than an F430, which was around the same time, and it was basically the same curb weight as my Carrera GT. That's pretty impressive for a Corvette from Kentucky. And of course, as you might expect, that meant big performance. 0 to 60 in 3.6 seconds. It would run the quarter mile in the 11s. Those numbers are still really fast today, and they were scorching 17 years ago when this car came out. It's pretty impressive stuff, again, for just a Corvette. But anyway, next let's move on to the exterior quirks of the Z06, starting with one of my very favorite things about this car, which was Well, actually, the subtlety. It's kind of funny to say that next to a bright red sports car, but this was fairly subtle compared to the standard Corvette and compared to a modern Z06, which has giant wide scoops and a huge rear wing, and it's clear that it's something crazy. This car really wasn't. Compared to the standard Corvette, it was kind of hard to tell it apart. There was the widened fenders, like I mentioned, but even that was somewhat subtle. You had a couple other upgrades on the side, like this little air channel here on the front fender, and then an air vent in back on the rear fender, and of course the side Z06 badge, but all of those were pretty small, not exactly crazy in your face. In fact, speaking of badging, that side Z06 emblem is the only one. It's on both sides, but there's none on the back to let you know you were looking at a Z06. This car was actually pretty under the radar, even though it had such major upgrades compared to a standard Corvette, and the subtlety kind of made it cool. Of course, that all went away the moment you revved the engine, and you could hear this was not a standard Corvette. Take a listen to the LS7 revving out. But anyway, some other interesting exterior quirks of the C6 Z06. Undoubtedly the quirkiest quirk is the roof. So all regular C6 Corvette coupe models were actually targas, which meant that the roof panel could be lifted off for an open air experience. But that was not the case in the Z06. They made it a true coupe for extra chassis rigidity. However, General Motors clearly didn't have the budget to actually create an entirely new body for this car, so even the Z06 has this little body line where the roof would lift off a normal Corvette. Again, this roof does not lift off. It's a fixed roof coupe, but on the outside, it looks like the roof should come off because they didn't want to give it a separate body and commit to spending the money over the standard car. Now, interestingly, the C5 Z06 did have a different body. It had a true coupe body with a trunk compared to the standard C5, which was a hatchback and a target top. But Chevy didn't want to do that for the C6. So you have a full coupe, but it looks like the top should be removed. You have a body line for no apparent reason. One other excellent General Motors addition on the outside, this car has a rear spoiler, as you can see, but it's very small and it's sort of right in the middle, and it's actually just a place for them to mount the third brake light. It doesn't look like a rear spoiler at all. I think they just wanted something they could put the third brake light on, and so they gave it sort of a faux spoiler to solve that issue. Kind of classic General Motors. By the way, one other exterior change worth noting on the Z06, up front, this little scoop above the Chevy logo. That was unique to the Z06. The standard Corvette model didn't have that. It was another way to tell this car apart on the outside. But anyway, next we move inside the C6 Z06, which is a bit quirkier than I was expecting, but I'm going to start with, well, the elephant in the room, which is the interior quality, which is not really all that great. This is a drawback of Corvette models from this era and previous eras, frankly. And while each successive Corvette has gotten better than the previous, it's still not that great by the C6. You got a lot of sort of cheap looking hard plastics in here that don't feel or look that nice. You have the word Corvette imprinted over onto the dashboard, which just kind of looks cheesy. It's not really the nicest place to spend time. Now, it's a big improvement over the C5 and the C5 Z06, which are also great values, amazing performance cars, but the interiors were even worse. This is better than that, but you're still not into the level of real high quality until you get C7 era. This car is cheap speed, and it's reflected on that in the interior. And one other drawback in here, there's not much Z06 distinction compared to the standard car. I like the subtle exterior, but when you're inside, you want to celebrate the fact that you got the cool one, but there's just not that much that does it. You get Z06 embroidered into the seat headrest, as you can see, and you have a little Z06 badge in the tachometer, but that's it. Otherwise, nothing Z06 specific in here. You don't even get like tightly bolstered Alcantara sport seats. It looks like the same slidey leather you got in the regular Corvette. On the door sills, it just says Corvette, not even Z06. There's no real other upgrades in here to let you know that you got the special one. So a little bit of a drawback inside. Thankfully, there is a sufficient amount of quirks to make up for it. Starting with getting in, you stick your hand into this like void next to the door. In there, there's a little electronic button popper. You push it, the door electronically pops open, and then you open it the rest of the way. Now to get out, same deal. There's no traditional door handle, just a popper button. You push that and then open up the door. Just in case you're worried that the battery might fail or your electronic popper might trap you inside your Corvette, there is still a mechanical release in the footwell on driver and passenger sides. You can pull that and the door will manually mechanically open. And by the way, if the door is open, the little light where the door lock would normally be flashes. I don't know why. I don't know if it's telling you, hey, the door is open. Yeah, I know. But that little light just sort of flashes until you close the door. An interesting quirk of the Z06. Another interesting quirk is that this car has a starter button, but it is very strange. It's mounted here where you'd expect, but the operation is weird. To start the car, you press it up, and it's actually a switch. Up turns it on, and down turns it off like a light switch. You want to turn it on, you push it up. You want to turn it off, you push it down. It's all very weird, and even weirder that you get a normal metal key with this car. I don't know where you'd stick it in, but you have it to operate the car, I guess. This was the early infancy of starter buttons, the mid-2000s, and automakers did all sorts of weird things, and this is certainly one of them. But anyway, next up, you start the car, and this little pixelated display in the gauge cluster screen tells you this is a Corvette by Chevrolet, and then it says, America! Which I guess the owner must have added. It must be configurable. You can have it say whatever you want, including your name or whatever, but that little display screen pops up every single time you start the car as a reminder of Corvette by Chevrolet, and then the name you've chosen. Now, this little display at the bottom of the gauge cluster can be configured to show different information using these buttons over on the right side of the cluster, and frankly, it can show a wide range, surprisingly so. You get your trip odometer, your fuel range, your fuel economy, your oil life, all sorts of different stuff. You can toggle through it all using these buttons on the side of the gauge cluster to show whatever it is you want to see on this screen. Despite its small size, it's not a full screen, high quality display. It's actually pretty useful with some good info. Now, there's also a group of buttons on the left side of the gauge cluster, and those control the heads-up display, which is projected onto the windshield. As you can see, this is a common feature in modern cars, but was rare in the mid-2000s. The Z06 has it, and it gives some pretty good information. It's again not full color, high quality like some modern cars, but it shows you what you need to see, and it's adjustable with these buttons on the side, and it's nice to see that. Now, the other major piece of technology in this interior is the center screen, which is, well, very 2000s, let's just say. This is a touch screen, so you tap it and it does stuff, but it also has very small buttons that adjust different menus over on the left, which was a hallmark of these 2000 center screens. And well, look at the navigation system. This isn't something you're going to want to use on a frequent basis, but it's there in case you do want to use it. It controls navigation and stereo and some other menu options, and it has a really cool CD slot inserter. Press the eject button at the bottom and the screen folds out to reveal a hidden CD and DVD slot. You can stick stuff in and then press the button again and it closes the screen. Next up, also interesting here in the center, is the traction control off button, which is this one. It actually shows the back of a Corvette slipping, although to me that looks more like a C5 than a C6, so I bet they just reused the button, but it's still a cool personalized button, which is neat to see. Now, in this center console, you can also see the 6-speed manual transmission, which was mandatory on the C6 Z06. There were no automatics, and you also have cup holders here, which are tremendously small, not really useful or usable for anything, but they are there just to satisfy the requirement. Check the box. Yes, we do have cup holders. It's also worth pointing out, inside you can clearly see that this is a fixed roof coupe. There's no latches to undo any targa top. It's much more clear sitting in the interior that the roof is fixed in place and doesn't come off, compared to the outside where it's still kind of questionable, frankly. And finally, we move on to the the cargo area of the C6 Z06, which can be accessed by pushing a little button in the interior next to the steering wheel, as you can see, or this cool little button on the key fob, which looks like a Corvette with its tailgate open. You push that, and then you can open it up and see that you actually have a pretty good-sized cargo area in here. It's surprisingly large, surprisingly practical, considering that this is a Corvette, a serious sports car with a 7-liter engine. You got room where you can stick stuff in here. And there are a couple of interesting quirks in the cargo area. For one, you get 2 little panels on either side. Now, the panel on the right, you open that up and it contains the battery, as you can see, but the panel on the left, you open that up and it contains nothing. So it's actually extra storage. You can put smaller items in here if you don't want them rolling around while you're doing your racetrack laps in your Z06. Stick them inside the little trunk inside the trunk. You also have a cargo net back here, which can also keep stuff from rolling around. And, well, this is open to the interior. So for especially large items, I guess in theory, you could just use it as a pass-through, stick it through to the front seats, and then you can fit even more stuff in your 505 horsepower, lightweight, high-performance sports car. All right, driving the C6 Z06. I really like this car, starting with just how it feels. Like, this thing feels like performance. Like, you get inside and you have this shift lever that you notch into gear. Like, there's nothing vague about it. You're like doing something when you're making shifts in this car. And you have this exhaust note. I mean, even at idle, it's insane, but when you rev it, you're just like, oh, I mean, it roars. Like, you really feel like stuff is happening in this car. This feels like, well, frankly, the performance car that it really, really is. This is just a muscle car. You know, people don't think of the Corvette as a muscle car. It's more of like a true sports car. But like, when I think of muscle cars, this is what I think of. A 427 under the hood and a big sound and, you know, relatively inexpensive interior, not incredibly nice, but just like that wasn't the point. Like, if you wanted something nice, they could have done that. They weren't trying to do that. Vroom is what they were trying to do. Oh, listen to that. The C6 Z06 really is like an amazing, amazing value, and I think its existence as an amazing value has kind of been overshadowed by the C5 Z06, which everybody is always constantly talking about being an amazing value. Well, this car has also kind of snuck down into the range. It's not as rare as the C5 Z06, which is made in small numbers for a shorter period of time, but it's more insane. It's just like such a crazy, raucous, wild thing. It's 500 horsepower from a 7-liter and a V8. And man, you can just feel it. Oh. It has so much power. It still feels tremendously quick by modern standards. Like really, really legitimately quite fast. And you hear it grunting, and it's just, this thing is just a big honking car with performance and engine and excitement and thrill, exactly what you're looking for. C5 Z06s are great steering and handling cars, surprisingly so, but this is better. This is like on a slightly different level of good in terms of its precision and its capabilities. The steering feel is still not amazing. You don't have like European car precision, which did exist when this car was out. It's not quite in this one, but it still is like a very quick steering car, and from a handling perspective, it does stay fantastically flat in corners, although you are always kind of under the impression that at any moment the tail might come out. I don't know how true that is, but I have a suspicion it's not totally untrue. There's a lot of big, unchecked power. The clutch has a bit of like a switch feel to it. It's not as smooth and progressive as some. And then you combine that with the accelerator, kind of like you push it and you're going. There takes some like finesse to get a smooth start. It doesn't always happen every time. Then you have the ride quality, which is kind of rough, and the sound, which is kind of loud. And of course, you only have 2 seats, although you do have decent cargo storage like I showed you. But this car isn't something that I would want a daily, and that was kind of the whole thing about the Z06. It was the high performance alternative to the more dailyable regular Corvette. And going over now a pretty rough road here, whew, the suspension is harsh. That's what creates a flat handling and cornering experience in this car that it honestly, again, kind of punches above its weight class in terms of like how good it is to drive, how good it is to actually steer and handle. There's so much good to say about the C6 Z06. Some people won't like it because it's a Corvette, which I get to an extent. This is a certain, image. But if you just want a great performance car that'll be relatively reliable and relatively cheap to own, that can dust basically anything and that just feels fast and cool and loud and powerful, all for the price of a nice Honda Accord, this is the car. And I have to say, I've been a big C5 Z06 evangelist over the last 5-10 years. I've told everybody to get one of those. I'm kind of moving into this now. It's not that much more money. It's a lot more power. And frankly, it's just it's better inside. And frankly, it's just more exciting. It's just a more like throw you back, kick you in the pants kind of car. And it feels like that to drive. And so that's the C6 Chevy Corvette Z06. I've talked a lot before about how great of a value I think the C5 Corvette Z06 is, but I think this is better. More power, more fun, a nicer interior, frankly, a more modern driving experience, and it's still a bargain. And you can get this C6 Z06 on Cars and Bids. Anyway, now it's time to give the C6 Corvette Z06 a DougScore. And the DougScore is here, 58 out of 100, which places the C6 Z06 here against some sort of similar cars. It beats out some heavy hitters, including the Acura NSX, although it's important to keep in mind the NSX gets a much higher weekend score. The Z06's advantages in daily categories like equipment and value. Overall, the C6 Z06 is a truly impressive car with amazing performance for the money, and it's a great way to get into 500 horsepower without spending a fortune.